This was a wood turning idea that I just had to get out. I'd gotten some suggestions to do a wood turning where you start with a finger jointed box and then you turn that so that you see the joint in the final piece. So I thought what would be neat is to do the joint on the CNC machine and make a curvy finger joint that you would see in the final turning. So this bowl's a little bit of an experiment. I started with two different pieces of wood, a piece of walnut and a piece of maple. And the piece of walnut was from a commercial lumber yard, so it was fairly straight. But the piece of cherry I had milled up a few years ago, and it had changed shape quite a bit. It was quite warped. So getting the piece of walnut ready was straightforward, but it took a few tricks to get the piece of cherry nice and straight. But luckily it was quite a bit bigger than I was going to need, so I had quite a bit of material to use to cut the piece down to a nice straight rectangular piece. So I jointed and then I cut the two pieces to the same width and I planed them to the same thickness. And I cut them to the same length, although this wasn't really that important. And I had two pieces of wood that were two different species that were exactly the same size. Now before I could start making the joint, I wanted to make a fence on the CNC table, and this would allow me to cut each segment exactly the same way, and that they would make a ring of segments that were all the same. So my fence is basically just a straight edge with two clamps on it. And the idea for holding it to the table was to bolt it through the holes in the table to a backer piece so that there'd be the fence on the top of the table and then there's a piece behind the table that's sandwiching the CNC table, which holds the fence in place. Then I can set the angle of the table. I'm doing this so that I'll get 8 segments. And I can cut out one side of the joint. And once I have one side cut, I can then flip the piece over and cut the other side, and I'll get a mitered joint with a curvy finger joint pattern in it. Now I wanted to make each segment the same length, so I made a quick little jig, or a quick little stop that I could put on the table when I was cutting the second cut of the segment. With that, I could make each segment the same length. So I'd put the jig down on the table and then I could slide the piece of wood up to the stop. Once I had the piece in the right location, I could then cut it off of the end of the piece of wood. And I had 2 patterns that I was cutting in the computer. One for the first cut and then one for the cut that cuts the piece off. And in doing it this way, the pattern has to be symmetrical. It would be nice to do something like this at some point where the pattern is sort of more random. So I can glue the ring together. That was actually easier than I thought it was going to be. Now for the bottom, what I thought I would do is make a segmented ring out of the same wood as the sides of the turning and have the bottom match up with the joints in the side. So I glued up some wider pieces of the same cherry and walnut. And to make that segmented ring, my new sled doesn't accommodate that width of segment. So I took one of the fences off. Then I can use the sled as just a regular angled sled with one fence. But this gives me the room to make the larger segments. And I need to make the 2 pieces the same width. or it doesn't work when it's being glued up. And I can cut all the segments. And I can lay the segments out. I wanted a pattern that was similar to the sides of the bowl. I tried to make the angle of the fence as accurate as I could, but it was still off a little bit, so my ring didn't quite go together perfectly. So I glued it in 2 halves. And while that dries, I can take the side piece apart. And I was going to need to hold this down to the CNC table. So what I did was I glued some scrap pieces of wood to the sides of the ring. And this will give me a spot to hold the ring on the table. And then my bottom was half glued, and I could glue the 2 halves together. And in doing the sanding to get the 2 halves flat, I lost my center point. So the center is not quite as nice as I had hoped. Now to attach the bottom to the sides, I thought what I'd try and do is cut out a circle in the sides and then cut the bottom to that same circle so that the bottom and the sides will fit together. And the sides will come all the way down over the bottom, so you won't see the bottom on the side. So I cut a couple of test rings first because I only had one chance to cut my bottom into a circle. And I made my ring for the bottom a little bit big so that I'd have a spot to hold the ring down to the table. And even with my tests, I was just a hair too big. Very carefully sanded the outside edge of the circle. And I sanded off the little bridge pieces. And I sanded the top and bottom of the circle. I need a tight seam on the top of the bottom between the sides and the bottom. And then the bottom of the bottom, I need a flat surface as well. So I could glue the bottom to the sides. And I wanted to line up the pattern when I was doing this as well. Now on the bottom, I'd like to glue a round piece of scrap wood, and this will let me hold the whole piece with the chuck on the lathe. I was thinking I would cut the circle out on the CNC and have a nice perfect circle, but then after thinking about it, it made more sense to just do a quick scrap piece of wood and then make it round on the lathe and not try and center it while I'm gluing it. So I can have this round piece be in the center of the rim on the other side of the bowl. So if I hold the bowl in the chuck like it is, it's now spinning around the center that I want to turn it around. And I can make the tenon also be centered about that same center. So I can basically just shape this to where it fits in the chuck. And I can take it off the lathe. I realized at about this point that it would make sense to cut off the little scrap pieces I had glued to the sides instead of trying to turn those off on the lathe. So I quickly cut them off on the bandsaw. Then at this point I'm ready to do the main turning. So I can clean up the outside. That was pretty easy. I don't have a whole lot of material with the way that I constructed this. I don't have a lot to work with as far as changing the shape. So it's going to basically just be a cylinder. It'd be nice at some point to figure out how to do this finger joint so that the sides are flared. I guess that would be doing a compound miter joint with the curvy fingers in it. I figured I would save that for next time. And I can do the inside. I could do the rim. And once I have the shape fairly close, I can then scrape all the surfaces and get them pretty smooth. And I can work on the bottom a little bit. Then I can sand, and the sanding on this actually was pretty quick. I managed to get a good surface with the scraper. The inside and the sides are done. So I can turn it back around and basically just turn off the tenon that I was using to hold the piece on the lathe. And once I got that down pretty small, I could then cut it off with a saw and then go back and turn off the last little bit. Then it's just some finish and it's done. I didn't really make a way to hold this on the lathe, so I sort of have to do it by hand. But it's a pretty simple shape, so it's not too hard. I learned a lot doing this. This was something I had thought was going to be like a day or two, and I'd just kind of bust it out and I'd be done and sort of learn a few things, but it's been like a week and a half of futzing around with it. Thanks for watching.